Let's move over to the defensive matchup, Ryan, and this is where you're going to get more good on good, I think, in this matchup. And I think right now you look at this particular run game versus run defense matchup, and I think it's pretty even. And it just depends on which version of Notre Dame shows up. And there, obviously, I think USC not having Travis Dye hurts them, but they have run the ball. They did run the ball okay last week. A lot of that was about Caleb Williams, though. I thought that what we saw last week was they needed a little bit more of his magic last week to be effective running the football. And one thing they did also last week that I thought was really effective, Austin Jones had a good game, 120 yards. He had a nice performance. But what they did also, and since he's been in the lineup, they do a pretty good job of getting him the ball in space with like little simple swing routes. So where they're not as dependent, because their offensive line has turned into a pretty good pass blocking unit, right?
Yep.
Which we'll get into, but they're not a great run blocking unit. They're more just like they were at Oklahoma some years, where their run game success comes from scheme and teams playing the pass. So what they've done this year is they do a lot of getting the ball out to their backs. I mean, Austin Jones has 16 catches for 61 yards. If I remember correctly, Travis Dye had a decent number of receptions this year as well, Ryan. Yes, he had 21 for 202, and a lot of that stuff is just little swing checkdowns, right? And you're sitting there thinking, okay, you've covered deep pretty well, and all of a sudden either Caleb Williams runs or they check it down, and that's almost like they'll do it too, where they did against UCLA, where it was a swing screen. They're throwing the screen, and it's basically like a toss play, which has to be looked at as that. So, I mean, Austin Jones is a good football player. I don't think he's as physical of a runner as Travis Dye is, but he's athletic. He's got some ability. So their run game's not going to be terrible because Travis Dye is out. It just means there's just now kind of a one style where Jones and Raleek Brown are both fast slashers. Yes. Travis Dye was a slasher, but he also had some physicality to him. And I think they list that, but that's what Caleb Williams added against UCLA. The question is, do you really want to dial that up the next 2 weeks with Caleb Williams kind of being needed to provide some of that or not? I don't. He's capable of it, but do you really want him taking that beating? Because if you lose Caleb Williams from this offense, it's a whole different football team. Football team.
I mean, it's all due respect to Miller Moss, but he's not Caleb Williams, right? I mean, to your point, he's a talented kid, but Caleb Williams is the difference, I think, in the run game right now, Brian, to your point, because how I see USC, and you let me know if you see it any differently, this is a very movement-based offense from a running game perspective, right? Like, they are not the most powerful offensive line of all time, but they do have a couple good athletes up front, right? Like,
angles.
They have some
angles.
They work angles tremendously well. They create nice creases based upon movement, and guys like Austin Jones have enough juice and explosiveness to create some plays, some chunk plays, which is a testament to them because they actually aren't very good as far as they allow a lot of tackles for loss on their offense from the run game perspective, but yet they still average a pretty nice yard per carry average. Mm-hmm. So they create some explosive plays, but it's much more to your points. I just want to reiterate it. They're not a power running team. They are a team that wants to make teams. You want to create movement with your movements, work angles, and create creases in that way. So you could expect a lot more inside and outside zone, some stuff like Brian said, as far as like, hey, let's hit some swing screens to the perimeter. We're trying to get guys in a lot more space than just get downhill and read and react to what you're seeing up front, right? Like these is much more space-oriented offense from a running game perspective.
Now, Notre Dame, on the other hand, Ryan, is a very interesting team when you look at it, really how their run defense has been this season. And rough start, right? I mean, Ohio State didn't put up great numbers, 172 yards, 4.9, but that's because Ohio State didn't really run the ball a ton or successfully in the first half. When it became money time, Ohio State was able to lean on Notre Dame and wear them down late, and their run game in the fourth quarter was the difference. Late third quarter, fourth quarter was the difference in that game. Next week against Marshall, run defense really struggled, Ryan, and they couldn't stop a kid who was working in a what was it, like a lumber yard or like something like a Lowe's type of place, the year before, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you come out and you do a pretty good job against Cal's rushing offense, give 112 yards. Most of that was scrambles. They had like a 20-yard run. The rest of it was like scrambles by by Jack Plummer, and then you completely shut down North Carolina. BYU has a couple big runs, and then since then, the run defense really, outside of the 170-plus yard run against UNLV, the run defense really since the end of the Marshall game has been pretty outstanding if you really break it down. And I'm going to pull up the numbers, and the one thing I'm going to do to put this in a proper context is take the Navy game out, simply because it's not so much about taking it out because they gave up yards, but taking it out because it's a triple option. It's a different brand. It's a completely different animal. But in Notre Dame's since the BYU game, when the rush defense was not great, in the 6 games, the 5 games against non-option teams since then, Notre Dame's only given up 90 yards a game rushing.
That's awesome.
And they're only giving up 2.9 yards per carry.
Yep.
So the run defense has been pretty good. Now, part of that has been they've played some teams that aren't good at running the football, like Stanford's not very good at running the football. Boston College is not very good at running the football. They're ranked last in the country, and Notre Dame held them below their season average. But Syracuse is a pretty good running team, and they held them to 61 yards. Clemson's a pretty good running team. They held them to 90 yards. And so, those teams, they were able to really shut down their ability to run the football. And so we've seen them, against good teams and bad teams, that they've really been able to slow them down and be successful against them. So this makes this a very fascinating matchup, because I'm going to say it right now. And by the way, in the game before they played Notre Dame, Clemson rushed for 293 yards against Syracuse. In the game after they played Notre Dame, against a team that's now ranked in the top 25, they beat Louisville. They beat Louisville 31-16, rushed for 248 yards, and then they ran for 207 yards against Miami. So, point being, that was an anomaly for Clemson, and Notre Dame completely shut them down in that game. So, we're going to talk a lot about the pass game, and we'll kind of get into the keys to victory, Ryan. But this is a matchup where that's on paper pretty even, that Notre Dame can't have it be even practically on the game. They cannot allow USC to be balanced. And that's the one thing that UCLA could not do. UCLA could not make them balanced. And make them unbalanced. They could not make them and it may sound crazy. You want them to throw the football. That's what they're going to do. Now, here's an interesting thing that I'm going to ask you about, Ryan. Is there merit in this game to doing kind of, I don't think there is, but I want to get, if you disagree. Clark Lee, I won't even ask. I'm just going to come out and say it, and then you can rebut it.
Okay.
Clark Lee had a very interesting strategy against USC.
Okay.
Which was much more of a traditional air raid, in that they did not run the football. Like Lincoln Riley's an air raid guy, but he's an air raid guy like Mike Shanahan was a West Coast guy, right? In that Mike Shanahan wasn't your traditional West Coast guy, because he was such a believer in, like, he combined West Coast with Alex Gibbs, right?
Outside zone,
and it was a different animal. And so I kind of feel like Lincoln Riley and Phil Longo are sort of different animals of the air raid relative to the founders, Hal Mumme, Mike Leach, guys like that, and then the tree. So like Lincoln Riley is from the tree of Mike Leach. He was at Texas Tech, but he's taken in a different direction that I think means that you can't do what Notre Dame did to Graham Harrell's air raid, which is force them to run the ball, because they can't beat you running the ball. I don't think that works against USC. I actually think in this version of USC, you actually have to make them you want them to throw, because they have to throw. You have to take away the run game. You have to take away the backs, and all of that entails. Ryan, do you agree or disagree with that sentiment?
I mean, as a defensive guy, I always want to stop the run. I don't care what the team is. I want the team to be one-dimensional, and I'll take my chances against the pass. I will, because there's a lot of good things that Caleb Williams and just in general an offense could do passing the football, but there's also a lot of negatives that could happen too, right? Sacks, forced fumbles, interceptions, bad throws. Like, there's a lot of negatives, tip passes. There's a lot of negatives that can happen passing the football, a lot more negatives that can happen comparative to running the football. And the worst thing that you can do is, okay, in theory, you want USC to run the football so that you are designing the defense to play the pass and Caleb Williams doesn't kill you. But then I would argue that most likely, if you are rushing the ball well, if you're USC, you're probably going to throw the ball well too, because it's just hard to counteract both. I want to shut one down, and and this is the traditionalist in me, I always want to stop the run. And this is not something particularly unique to USC. If I was talking about North Carolina, if I was talking about Clemson, if I was talking about any team that's just a different type of team, different systems, different philosophies, I want to stop the run. I do. I want to make a team one-dimensional. I want them to try to throw the football. From there, your guys got to make plays. But right here, Brian, like this can't be a game where you're like Austin Jones ran for 100-something yards, right? Like that's if that happens and Notre Dame gives up a decent amount of rushing yards and Austin Jones and Raleek Brown have a couple of nice runs and they are able to control this.
Caleb Williams is going off. Right.
Exactly. If that happens, then Notre Dame's going to lose this game, in my opinion. Like you can't let that happen. You have to force this team to be one-dimensional and you have to take your chances in the pass and you have to force them into some bad decisions, and your defensive line has to play well. So I've always been a stickler to let's stop the run first, and then we'll force mistakes in the passing game. That's always been my philosophy personally.
Right. I think that's key here too. I mean, you can if US in this look, this is and how do we see? I mean, this is how it was at Oklahoma, right? I mean, you look at last year. Why they almost get upset by Tulane? Part of it was they rushed for 116 yards, made them really one-dimensional, and then that forced them into mistakes and misses that allowed them to stay in the game, right? Barely beat West Virginia last year, ran for 57 yards. Barely beat Kansas State last year, ran for 131 yards. Lost to Baylor, ran for 82 yards. I mean, this has kind of been the formula against Oklahoma for a long time is if you can make them one-dimensional, you can keep them out of the end zone. And even some games that they won in the past, Ryan, where they won games but didn't score a ton of points because they weren't able to run the football effectively. Going back to 2020, they had 76 yards against Baylor that game and only scored 27 points. In the Big 12 title game against Oklahoma State or Iowa State, they ran for 120 yards and only scored 27 points. If Notre Dame can hold them to 27 points, you feel like you're going to have a shot to win this game, right? Well, then they go out into the bowl game against Florida and rush for 435 yards and beat Florida 55-20. Right? I mean, if they run the ball on you, you've got Lincoln Riley. I'm going to go back and look at this. He doesn't have a lot of losses where he's run for 200 yards. I'm going to actually go back and look at this. So 2021, no losses with 200 yards. 2020, no loss. I mean, their two losses that year were 130 and 114 yards rushing. 2019, their losses, they had 102 and 97 yards rushing. I mean, again, picking up a pattern here. So last time they lost a game where they ran for 200 yards was all the way back in 2018. They lost to Texas 48-45. So, yeah. I mean, it doesn't happen often. They don't lose and they run for they don't lose if they rush for 200 yards. And then the only time before that, Ryan, was in the overtime game against Georgia in the playoff where they outshot Georgia. And that USC's not that version of Oklahoma. Not yet.
Yeah.
They have the quarterback for it, but just the overall package. He's in year one. I mean, they could eventually get to that, but in year one, he hasn't been able to recruit the line the way that he wants to. He hasn't recruited, a lot of the skill. Hasn't been in a system for 2 or 3 years and all that type of stuff where they can learn all the ins and outs of what he wants to do, which gives him greater versatility as a play caller, right? So, I mean, I think they'll eventually get there if he stays at USC, but they're not there yet. They have to be balanced if they're going to win. And when this team is balanced, because Notre Dame doesn't have the kind of offense Georgia had that year, they don't have – I mean, their backs are good, but, that team also had that was just a better team. I mean, Georgia was national runners-up that year.
Yep.
So they're going to have to keep the run game in check. That to me is the biggest key. The biggest key to stopping Oklahoma, in my opinion.
Brian, the analytics crowd is going to hate you so much. You're telling
really
me
care.
Running the football matters? Yeah. No way. I don't believe it.
Yeah.
You the basketball every play and win. I don't know. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I love the sarcasm coming out of it because those people are idiots.
Dude, I have so many conversations on Twitter where people try to tell me running the football doesn't matter. I'm just like, okay, all right, sure.
Okay. I mean, maybe in the NFL because nobody does. Like, that's the thing is NFL is such a different game than college. There's so many more teams. There's so many different types of football. I mean, there's not a ton of diversity in the NFL, and there's not. Even if you look at a team like the Titans, and I don't know if the Titans are still this way, but in past years where they're just like this really they're still doing a lot of similar concepts. They're just emphasizing this over that. There's no like air raid versus pro style versus triple option versus spread option. I mean, there's so much different stuff. And I just think you don't see a lot of teams in college football that are good that don't run the football.
You're
Right?
not wrong.
At least not good consistently.
Yep.
You've got to be able to run the football consistently. And, like you look at Mississippi State, they're probably the closest thing to that. And I'm looking down at like the bottom part of the country, and there's just not a lot of teams down there that are any good. Iowa's not very good. I'm looking at it here: Washington State and Texas Tech. Mississippi State. But what's the problem that Mississippi State has? When they lose, it's because their offense can't score. Because when teams can take their pass away, they have nothing. They have nothing. That's why Lincoln Riley's offense is so much better than Mike Leach's nowadays, right? It's why Phil Longo's offense is so much better than Mike Leach's nowadays, because it's less slump proof. It's more slump proof, in my opinion, than what we see again in other games. And why did Phil Longo have the issue that he had against Georgia Tech this past week, Ryan? What happened to North Carolina in that game? Couldn't run football.
Yep.
Right? This team is not good at running football. So they had 163 yards rushing, and I think like 70 of it came on one carry, like early in the game. They had that long touchdown run early, and then after that, can run football, right? And that's what's really hurt them. That's why this version of his offense is not as good as past offenses, and it's been so reliant on Drake May just being unbelievable, right? And that's where he can't put what's allowed Caleb Williams to be so mistake-free beyond his talent. I mean, his talent's part of that too. Right.
Sure.
I was having this conversation with a buddy last night, and we were talking about, John Elway, and he's a Steeler fan. And, the pass that John Elway threw to get a first down on third down to Shannon Sharp in the 1997 AFC championship game, or excuse me, divisional game. And he's like, oh, the guy almost intercepted it. And I was like, no, he didn't. And we went back and watched the play, and he didn't. And he said, why? Because John Elway threw it 100 miles an hour, and there was no way that guy was going to get his hand on it. It was like, Shannon Sharp was catching that ball, whether Shannon Sharp wanted to catch the ball or not. That's just the way he threw it. Well, Caleb Williams can do some of that. Like that throw against UCLA where he's running to his left there and put on Twitter. Like there's like maybe two, three guys in all of college football that can make that throw with that velocity. There's not
many outside of Josh Allen and Pat Mahomes. There's not many guys in the NFL that do that either.
So he's going to make some of those plays, but overall, what helps him be a guy that just doesn't turn the ball over is that they are able to make teams respect all parts of their game. And Lincoln Riley is not afraid to come out and say, if you're going to like overplay our pass game, that's fine. We're going to go off today with our run game. We're going to go off, and we're going to beat you up the middle running, and we're going to beat you over the middle throwing, because you're trying to protect the outside so much. And I think that's why you have to be able to control the run game with your box. You have to be able to control the run game with your box, and then be able to protect outside, because you can't stop both, right? I mean, I don't think. No. So the one you can stop, to me, is the one up front. And so you got to get Jason Adamiola back. JD Bertrand has to keep doing what he's been doing. And then I'm very curious to see how they use Maris Lewis in this game to attack. I'm very curious about that. That's going to be a very fascinating aspect of this game. So we'll see how that goes. This next part, Ryan, this is one of the good on good matchups, in my opinion. And Notre Dame's got some interesting numbers in this regard, because here's a couple things that to me are very fascinating about Notre Dame's numbers. Their yards per completion is not great. A lot of that comes down from the North Carolina game, where they gave up some, garbage plays late. They averaged 17.7 yards per catch. That's not how that game played out, right? I mean, a lot of that came after it was 38-14. They've been prone at times to giving a big play here or there, but when you look at their yards per game, their yards per attempt, their efficiency numbers, and sacks, those are the numbers that really tell you the tale of how good you are on pass defense. And Notre Dame has proven to be a very good pass defense this year. And yes, they've beaten up on teams that aren't good throwing the football, but they've also done a really good job, Ryan, in my opinion, against teams that can throw the football, because USC right now in passing yards per game ranks 4th nationally in passing yards per game. But Notre Dame's also played North Carolina, who ranks 6th, and Ohio State, who ranks 17th in passing yards per game. And then Ohio State, I believe, is 3rd in yards per attempt. USC is 7th, tied for 7th with North Carolina. So Notre Dame has played teams that have dynamic receiving cores and really good quarterbacks this year.
Yep.
Now, you could argue CJ Williams is the most talented of all the quarterbacks they've played, and I really wouldn't push back on that, to be complete, as arm talent-wise.
Mm.
And he's definitely a better runner than CJ Stroud, but he's very similar to Drake May in that regard, right? And they've played receiving cores with a lot of speed. And so this is not a new test for Notre Dame, but it doesn't mean that, because they did well then, they're going to do well now. They still have to be on top of their game to stop this pass offense, because ultimately at the end of the day, if you hold them to 100 yards rushing but give up 450 passing, you're still going to lose, right?
Right.
And so that's going to be a key. Is you're going to have to find ways to create minuses for USC, whether it's incompletions, tackles for loss on their perimeter screen game, breakups, tipped passes, interceptions, all of that. It's the whole gamut. You're going to need to get some of that. You got what it comes down to, Ryan. You've needed to create as much inefficiency as possible with the USC pass game. It's much easier said than done, but as the statistics show, it's much easier said than done. But that's what's going to be the key. But Notre Dame has done that. That's what they did against Ohio State, and that's what they did against North Carolina, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's –
and they have a lot of good athletes on this USC team, right? Like we've talked about Jordan Addison already a little bit. We're talking about Taj Washington, Brandon Rice, Austin Jones working out of the backfield. They have some guys that can do damage after the catch. And I think that's first for me, Brian, is that this team needs to be, and they have been in recent weeks, they have to be really good on the edges tackling. Like I think Benjamin Morrison's done a nice job. Cam Hart, when he's been out there, has done a nice job being able to tackle in that screen game and not let those 3 to 4 yard gains turn into 8 to 9, right? And then get you into second and shorts and third and shorts. And this is a team where, again, this isn't unique to USC. This is unique to pretty much every. Well, this is unique there. This is not unique. It is a similarity between every team. You want to get them in second and longs and third and longs. You want to, because it's the situation where now they are limited with what they can do and how they can operate as an offense. So Notre Dame needs to tackle well in the perimeter. I believe that wholeheartedly. And this can't be, and I've seen people already say this in the chat earlier in the show, Brian, where, hey, Cam Hart or Benjamin Morrison need to go and shadow Jordan Addison. And I disagree. I disagree tremendously.
Do what you do.
Your offense, your secondary needs to be a collaborative effort. You need to be good across the board because this team has multiple weapons. This isn't just the Jordan Addison show. Is Jordan Addison great? Yeah, of course he is. Very good football player. There's a reason he won the Blitnikoff last year, right? There's a reason he's going to be drafted pretty high in the draft this year. He's a good football player, really good college player, no doubt about it. But Taj Washington's a good football player too. Brandon Rice is a good football player. Kyle Ford has made some plays. Like they have receivers that have the ability to beat you if put into a good situation for themselves. So Notre Dame across the board is going to take a collaborative effort from the Ben Morsons of the world, from the Brandon Josephs of the world, from the Xavier Wattses of the world, from the Tariq Bracy's, from the Clarence Lewis's, for everyone across the board. This is a make it or break it game for the secondary. They need to, because they've been a strength much better than anybody gave them credit for from a fan base perspective before the season. Notre Dame's secondary has played really well, and it's been a good pass defense for Notre Dame. This is right up there as their biggest test. You mentioned against North Carolina. You mentioned against Ohio State. This is another potent passing attack with a great quarterback and a lot of weapons. Notre Dame's secondary needs to come to play on Saturday. This is a vital matchup to figuring out who's going to win this game.
Well, it's kind of funny, Ryan. Roger Dodger, our resident USC fan, has made a comment about how there's a not a lot of. Let me just go here real quick and find this real fast because I want to pull this up. So there's a lot of lower numbers on the right. Again, this is why we provide context. Notre Dame has pretty low numbers on the left when you consider they've played 2 top 10 pass offenses this year. The highest ranked pass defense in the Pac-12 from a yards allowed per game standpoint is Utah, who ranks 50th nationally. The next best is 59th at Oregon State, who did a pretty good job shutting them down. So, I mean, you're talking about you have to look at the context of the fact that the Pac-12 just does not have very good pass defenses. The one team that's pretty good at keeping yards and yards per attempt and yards per completion down is Oregon State. Oregon State ranks in the top 25 in yards allowed per attempt, and they rank in the top 25 in yards allowed per completion. How many points did USC score in that game? 17. Right? So, again, what Oregon State was able to do is they were able to create inefficiency in the USC pass game. And that's something that a lot of teams in that conference have tried to do and can't because they don't have the coaching, nor do they have the players. And this is what you and I talked about a while ago when we were talking about a matchup that Oregon State had recently. You know, they've got a pass defense that usually is pretty good at creating inefficiency. And that's what they're able to do against USC, is they were able to create some inefficiency. Now, everyone else has tried to do it, but no one else has been able to, have success with it. They held USC to 180 yards and 44.4 yards per attempt. That was a bit of an off day for USC. It's part of it. Caleb was missing some throws he normally makes. But the other part of it is USC's defensive backs were very physical and very aggressive at getting hands on the football. And that's going to be a big key. And the pass rush got to him pretty consistently. And there wasn't a lot of places for him to go. They did a really good job controlling the rush lanes, I thought, in that game as well. It was a really well-coached game, really well-executed game. At the end of the day, though, USC won. Why? Because their offense couldn't score. And that's my big concern. Or Oregon State's offense couldn't score. That's my big concern in this game is even if your defense plays great, if your offense doesn't step up, you're still going to lose. And that's the key is they're going to move the ball. They're going to get their points, as you said, Ryan. This is not going to be a 17-14 game, in my opinion. That was an anomaly. That game was an anomaly for USC. But I think the recipe for success that Oregon State implemented is the recipe for success. They're just the only defense in the league that had the ability to pull it off, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah.
I thought Washington State did a good job with that early. They just didn't have enough athletes late. That was because USC's played a couple games this year, Ryan. Arizona State was that way. Washington State was that way, where that game was a lot closer than the final score showed. Stanford, I felt, was kind of that way. Now, as they've kind of gotten later in the year, they've had a couple games that were, I'd say, close games on the box score, but really weren't as close.
Yeah,
Per se, as you'd think. Cal was that way, for example. It was a 6-point game. Kind of. It was 34-14 going in the fourth quarter, right? Yeah. Cal scored 21 points in the fourth quarter. Now, USC didn't finish, but we've seen that from Notre Dame. It doesn't mean that team is on your level or that team played with you, right? And, we saw that recently with Navy. So it's been interesting to watch this USC team kind of go through the year where early in the season they had some blowout games that were much closer than the final score would make you think. And then they've had games where, it's not as close. The Arizona game was the one exception. I thought that was a pretty competitive game for most of the game. And USC pulled away late in that game.
Yeah.
But that's where they are, man. They're going to move the ball. They're going to score. And for Notre Dame, it's about stopping it. So here, Ryan, we didn't really get into this rushing game, rush attack. I would say this. I think it's advantage Notre Dame, in my opinion, when you consider how well they've been playing lately with Travis Dye out, but it's a slight advantage. Here, it's definitely advantage USC. How much of an advantage? I don't think it's a huge advantage because, again, we've seen Notre Dame against this type of offense before, talent-wise, and they've held their own. But in one of the games, they couldn't make stops late that they needed to make to win, and the big plays cost them. In the other game, they were able to make all the stops they needed to early, and their offense stepped up. And then down here, the final part, Ryan, is this is going to be, to me, I'm going to go advantage USC here, even though it's close, for two reasons. Number one, Notre Dame has been a team that has not had any games where they've given up a lot of points, right? They've had two games where they gave up 32 points, and in both of those games, those teams scored a lot late. North Carolina scored a lot late. Navy scored a lot late. They've been able to keep points down, but until the BC game, they had never really shut anyone down, and that's a bad offense at USC. So you're going to give up some points. It's about creating stops and creating enough negatives, and I think that's one of the things that's been the big key for Notre Dame is when they can make stops, they're pretty good. When they can't, they're going to give up yards. And so USC, obviously, in a lot of these areas, ranks incredibly high in a league where there's not very good defenses. Notre Dame, in a lot of these areas, ranks pretty high when you consider the schedule they've played. But there's two areas, Ryan, that are going to be key to this game, which is why I give USC the advantage in this matchup. Number one, red zone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's crazy is that's actually a really big improvement for Notre Dame, because at one point in time, opponents were like 20 of 20
Yes.
or excuse me, 19 of 20 in red zone touchdowns. So they've actually been decent lately at keeping teams out of the end zone. And then the other one is turnovers. And again, Notre Dame has gotten a lot better, Ryan. I mean, they went through, they did one turnover through the first 6 games of the year, something insane like that.
Yep.
They've started to force a lot more turnovers. As they have, teams have been at, Clemson struggled to score on Notre Dame because they turn the ball over in crucial turnovers. I mean, Clemson beat Notre Dame's defense 14-7. It's kind of how I like to joke about it. But they tied the Notre Dame defense and special teams 14-14, right? If you can have something like that against USC where you're creating points with your special teams and defense, it only helps. But that's not something you can't game plan for that. Notre Dame, see here, 4, 5, 6, 7. Through the first 7 games of the year, Notre Dame forced 3 turnovers. In the last 4 games, they've created 10, including 5 against Boston College, 2 against Syracuse, 2 against Clemson. And those turnovers they forced in those 2 games were huge, because in both of those games, they had turnovers that resulted in touchdowns. You had the pick 6 against Syracuse and the pick 6 against Clemson. USC, however, does not turn the ball over. I mean, you see it right there. They're the best team in the country at not turning the ball over, and it's going to be hard to do. But that's where I give them the edge. And it's his arm talent, because there's throws that you're like, I'm not sure if he should be making that throw. Completion, because he's just got tremendous arm talent. I mean, that's really the thing. Like, why is he trying to fit the ball into? Oh, okay, completion, great, because he trusts his receivers, right?
Yes.
And he's going to give them chances, and he's got talented receivers. But the kid's just got tremendous tools, Ryan. He's a very, very talented player.
He is a very frustrating football player for a defensive player, because you're like, we had perfect coverage on that play, didn't have a ton of time to throw, but he still uncorks one and hits a window that just should not be a window that anyone else could hit. Like, it's just that's the one thing I really dislike about PFF, Brian. I don't know if you ever seen their turnover worthy plays or whatever they say, and I'm just like, that's very subjective, right? A turnover worthy play for one player may not be a turnover worthy play for another player. And Caleb Williams is kind of that guy, man, where you're just like, despite the fact that he does have a lot of gunslinger qualities, right? He's going to let it rip. He's going to take some chances. Still pretty safe with the football, man. Like, he doesn't put it in unnecessary spots too often. When he does, it's a play that he knows he can make. I mean, there's just like the throw I was talking about last week against UCLA. That was a bad decision, right? That's not a throw that, even if he saw it earlier, like, that's going to be completed. It was just a bad decision. There's going to, and that stuff, though, does not happen very often. He doesn't do that type of stuff. So when it does happen, the 1 or 2 times it happens a game, you have to capitalize, right? You have to make those plays. I think that's a big thing. But more than anything, just got to make this game one-dimensional and make him uncomfortable. You have to. Defensive line, I think, is going to be important. And the secondary playing a just good across-the-board solid football game is going to be crucial in this one. Because Caleb Williams is one of those athletes that, even when things aren't perfect, even when he's scattered a little bit and he has to rush his process or get out of the pocket, he can still make a ton of plays. So I think rush lanes are going to be a big thing in this football game. Caleb Williams could tear you apart from in the pocket, but I would rather see him in the pocket than see what he can do outside of structure, right? Like, I would rather just deal with that headache. So I think rush lanes and the secondary playing a good, solid football game, I think those are the 2 keys for me in this football game.
Yeah, Ryan, we'll talk about those later tonight. We'll get into keys later tonight specifically, but yeah, that how you handle him in the pocket is going to be a big part of that game. So that is the matchup of Notre Dame against USC, the statistical matchup of Notre Dame and USC tonight.